And now for our final speaker, we were able to secure a man who served for many years in very close association with Mr. Hoover, a man who is known for his dedication to the principles of law and order, who left his service in Washington to become the head of the police department of a great western city, who has performed brilliantly there, who has become an international expert and consultant on problems of law and order, and a man who has been completely devoted to the principles that we try to uphold. I want to add just a personal note of gratitude to him because he is here tonight under considerable strain because of the serious illness of his daughter. And I'm sure that if he weren't a man of integrity, a man of his word, that he would have found an excuse to leave us and be with his daughter. Fortunately, the medical reports are encouraging, and so he is still here with us, at least in body, although I think I know where his heart is. But it's a great satisfaction to present to you again from this podium, Clen Skousen.
Colonel Bunker, Dan, my friends and fellow Americans, this is one of the most important assemblies in America this year, and I therefore feel distinctively honored to have a small part in it, even for a few minutes. This happens to be an occasion when the great hearts and spirits of this land have a chance to gather together and share one another's strength. And on this eve, as we memorialize the life of a great man who struggled through the troubles of a generation now passing, I feel especially privileged to have a few moments to express some personal sentiments regarding him. Much of what I felt was necessary to say in the beginning of my talk was better said by Captain Gorman, and I appreciated the splendid way in which he caught the spirit of law enforcement that Mr. Hoover hoped would be reflected throughout the profession. You saw the well-balanced Christian American law enforcement personified in his presentation tonight. And I have a special and distinct appreciation for Dan Smoot. I honor him not only as a fellow worker in the FBI, but a man of great personal integrity who has the capacity to see beyond the superfluous, the propaganda, and the political climate, which is always changing. He has a unique and unusual capacity to penetrate through to rock bottom and hold up the standard of perfect performance which most people seem to lose sight of. I've just been constantly amazed at his great capacity to take us continually back to fundamentals so that we aren't confused by the changing tide and climate which surrounds us. And so his presence here tonight is an honor to all of us, and I'm sure you caught the message, the spirit of his message, which always contains warning with acclamation. I've noticed that's characteristic of him. This was great, but it could have been better. And no one would have been quicker to say that than J. Edgar Hoover. I watched him suffer and struggle in an effort to fulfill Dan Smoot's double hope, to leave the service of the FBI where he could talk and to write the book that he was capable of writing. In 1957, I was asked to invite him to be the commencement speaker at Brigham Young University. And he said, I would gladly come, but next year, not this one. By then I'll be free and unhampered, and I will really have a message. But I know now why he didn't leave. He suddenly discovered some of the things that took all of us a little while to discover, that those who had been foisted upon the American people as the conservators of constitutional principles, preservers of peace, opponents of communism, and preservers of great American constitutional principles were working hand in glove with those who were out to destroy the country, and doing it on a very ideological and for them sincere basis. This whole nation must be pushed hard to the left, while the communist dictators of the world must be accommodated to get them to move somewhat to the right, so that we end up with a monolithic socialistic world society in which peace and prosperity is forced upon the stupid masses of the world. And from the high and mighty and sanctified portals of their own temples, they look down upon the people as mere pawns to be manipulated politically to support that great ideal that they have in their minds, very carefully codified by Plato in his Republic, and afterwards spiritually epitomized in Utopia by Sir Thomas More, idealized in a sense by the utopian socialists, and captured in the Communist Manifesto by Marx, who said, all of you are too idealistic. You must put up a gun at the heads of the stupid masses to force them to work and to live socially until such time as the program is a total success and they are willing to accept it without the dictatorship. Now, this is the way it's all been unfolding, and Mr. Hoover knew it. Now, it's a very difficult thing to go to a president of the United States and warn him about the dangers of communism when Earl Browder has just been given office quarters downstairs in the basement. And that's what happened. And you find a man who is custodian now of files that would occupy 3 times the space of this auditorium, even in those early days, holding in his custody what he hopes may eventually become the framework for the prosecution of the guilty and the exposure of the conspirators, fearful that if he makes the wrong move, all of this treasure of knowledge and this historical repository of information will fall into the wrong hands and be burned. That's a terrible responsibility. And J. Edgar Hoover held it, lived with it, slept with it, plowed around the enemy, compromised in situations that I know of, and all because of a hope that sometime during his generation the American people at the grassroots would wake up sufficiently so that he could turn the whole torch of freedom and anti-communism and protection against subversion to other hands who would safely guard it and keep it. J. Edgar Hoover was a man with a personality of multifaceted complexity. He had the tough-mindedness and the will to win of a General Patton. There were a lot of things about General Patton that were also present in the personality of J. Edgar Hoover. He had a sense of history and the importance of his own place in it, much like General MacArthur. But he also had a sense of human compassion, a common touch, if you will, for the unfortunate, the victims of crime, for minorities, for those whose civil rights were being violated, and for children. This common touch, which I saw often manifested, was much like that of Abraham Lincoln. And he stood very humble in the presence of a monumental task that had been assigned to him, and worked with pride to do it well, much like Washington. I considered the hallmark of greatness of J. Edgar Hoover to be the fact that he did share those human qualities of other men whom we call great. Now, I've been asked what it was like to work for Mr. Hoover, close enough to see him once in a while, to feel the warmth both of his enthusiasm and his wrath. He had both. For 13 out of the 16 years that I served in the FBI, I was directly across the hall from the director's suite, in charge much of that time of the hottest spot in the Bureau, called the Communications Section. May I just share with you a little personal note on what it was like to enter the FBI? I entered in the gangster era, about the same time that Brother Dan here entered. Only 1 out of 300 applicants got appointed, so it was quite an exciting thing to even apply for a position in the FBI and get interviewed. I had originally gone to Washington from California when Senator McAdoo took the student body presidents of the colleges and invited them to go to Washington and accept political jobs so that they could learn about Washington, particularly if they were going into the legal profession, which was my choice. And so I went back as a legal auditor in the Department of Agriculture. The office of Alger Hiss was just 6 doors away. I wasn't a lawyer and I wasn't an auditor, but that didn't matter because we didn't have any work to do anyway. And I sat in that office month after month. I read all the good books I'd wanted to catch up on. I didn't have any work at all to do, and my desk mate told me I ought to go up to the Hill and get my senator and congressman to put pressure on the department to raise my wages. And somehow or another, this just didn't quite seem right, even for Washington. And what was worse, I was continually bugged by my roommate. He was student body president of Chaffey College, next to the one where I served as student body president. And he would come home at night with blisters on his feet and so exhausted he would collapse on the bed, too tired to eat supper, even when I cooked it. Or maybe that's why he used it as an excuse. But in any event, he didn't eat supper. And he'd finally arouse himself and he'd say, "I really like my job." He was a clerk in the FBI. I used to say, "Do you get to see Mr. Hoover once in a while?" "Yes, every day." And I later found out he was a messenger that delivered mail to Mr. Hoover every day, and they got to see him. Now, I finally said to him, "I think I would like to be a messenger in the FBI too." "Well," he said, "you'd have to take about $1,000 cut. And you have to start out as a messenger even if you have a PhD degree in those days, because you were either a graduate lawyer admitted to the bar or an accountant that had been certified as such, or you couldn't even apply for the position of an FBI agent. The labor market permitted that for a long time, and Mr. Hoover kept it just as high as he could, as long as there were people available to perform the task on that high level. So I wanted to go in as a messenger, and I applied. Now, my roommate said, when you go in, be very careful what you say, because they investigate everything. They're going to start back from the time you were born in Canada. They're going to trace you down to Mexico, where you went to school a couple of years, back to California, and everything they ask you, you answer honestly. They'll check it. And he says, wear your dark blue suit and don't wear that orange tie with green airplanes on it. So I went to be interviewed, and I tried to be as businesslike and formal as I could, but I was worried about one thing. Here was a red-blooded, two-fisted outfit that I was applying for a position in, and in my record I had 2 years that I just wasn't sure the FBI would understand. When I was 17 years of age, I was called by my church to go on a mission, and I served for 2 years as a missionary until I was 19, and then I was allowed to come home and went on to school and so forth. And I wondered if they might have some misconceptions about missionary work. Some people think, that's where you sort of abandon civilization and go off into the hinterland somewhere. And, well, I decided anyway I wouldn't call it missionary work. When he got to those 2 years, I would describe what we did, so he'd be sure and understand, or at least not misunderstand. So sure enough, he went right through my life up to the year that I left for England at the age of 17. He said, I see there 2 years here you worked for your church. Yes, sir. No salary, it says. That's right, sir. What did you do while you were over in England working for your church? So I said, well, did a lot of public contact work, did a lot of speaking, had custody of some of the funds and administration of the affairs of the church. And he stopped me and he said, you mean you were just doing regular missionary work? Yes, sir. He said, do you smoke? Well, that was kind of a personal question. I said, no, sir. He said, did you ever smoke? Yes, sir. When? When I was 11. So was it extensive? No, sir. He said, do you drink? And I could tell by the tone of his voice he didn't mean buttermilk. And I said, no, sir. He said, but you take a social drink. I said, no, sir. Now, there was something that was kind of spooky about this man. He had a long yellow pad in front of him, and when he would ask you a question, he'd get his pencil down on the pad, and while you were talking, answering, he was taking notes, and he never looked down. He just watched your eyes all the time you're talking. So when he asked me if I was a social drinker, and I said, well, no, I don't do that, he says, you mean you're a teetotaler? And I said, well, I don't drink. He said, that's a teetotaler. And he wrote it down. He said, do you know anything about FBI work? And I said, well, a little. He said, you expect to go through law school and become an agent, don't you? And I said, yes, sir. He said, we go out and look for thugs and fugitives and kidnappers and bank robbers, federal murderers. Do you know that? I said, yes, sir. He said, we don't find them at Sunday school parties. He said, what we actually do, we go into taverns and to bars and to joints, and we just kind of mingle with the crowd, and we try not to attract any attention. We're waiting for our fugitives to come in. You understand that? And I said, yes, sir. He said, how do you think a teetotaler would get along in a situation like that? And I said, well, I don't know. I've worked on construction camps and so I got along all right. I just have to handle it when I came to it, I guess. And I could just see I obviously was giving all the wrong answers and I wasn't going to get this job. So finally he finished the interview and he said, let me ask you about that missionary work. Did you like missionary work? And by this time I was getting a little aggravated, I think, a little bit. Anyway, I said, yes, I did. I enjoyed the missionary work. The job was gone, you know. And I said, yes, I enjoyed missionary work. Well, he said, I enjoyed my mission to Germany. That was the first hint I had that I was being interviewed by a member of my own faith. And I was being asked a list of questions that Mr. Hoover had made out for Mormons. And there was another list for Catholics. And there was another list for Protestants. And a special list for Jews. Because as I heard Mr. Hoover subsequently say, I always figured that anybody that would let down his church and his home training would let down the FBI. Well, I was pretty surprised when I got an appointment. And I later learned that if I had answered these questions any differently than I did, I probably would have never been asked to serve. And when I finally went out as an FBI agent and went into joints and taverns and so forth, I learned that no FBI agent drinks on the job. He'd be fired if he did. One drink will blur your vision if you have to shoot to save your life. We had little tricks. When we went into the bar, I had mine. I'd kind of go down to the end of the bar, like an old bar fly, kind of lean on the rail. And when I get the bartender's attention all sort of by himself, he'd come down and ask me for my drink. I'd say, I want a 7-Up straight. And he'd look at me as though he had at least one customer who knew when he'd had enough. And he'd fix it up with a cherry and a little mint leaf, a little slice of orange, and I'd walk around with it all day and mingle with the crowd. Well, it was exciting working for the FBI. In fact, when people have asked me what it was like to work for Mr. Hoover, that's the word I use to describe it. Exciting. Mr. Hoover had the special capacity to create a climate of crisis all the time. With him, fighting crime and spies and degraded humanity was a war, and he fought it like a general. And I became accustomed to working with adrenaline continually pouring into my blood. And so did all of those who were immediately around him. And he had occasion, he could project his personality into the field sometimes in the same way. Well, I learned to like that climate. And I never would have left the FBI if I hadn't been asked to go into a special area of service in education. And as Mr. Hoover said to me when I left the FBI after 16 years of service to go into education, you're leaving the defensive team and going on the offensive team. And if you ever want to come back, you know you'll always be welcome. And that was sort of the relationship that we had down through the years. Now, as I tried to minister the communications section as chief of that unit, I went all through the dimensions of communications, from messenger, typist, teletype operator, in charge of the emergency switchboard, in charge of coding and ciphering, and finally night chief, and then out into the field for a period of time, then back in as as chief of the whole section. So it was sort of an evolution in that program. And I watched all the frustration of Mr. Hoover. I came in shortly after the time when his life had been threatened and they had set him all up to be machine-gunned and riddled to death in the best Hollywood tradition. And Congress and others who knew about it insisted that he start riding in bulletproof cars, which he did. His life was really in constant danger. And I remember the note that came from Alvin Karpus that called him every dirty four-letter word he could lay his pen to and said, "I'm coming into the FBI headquarters with a machine gun and I'll riddle the place and I won't leave till you're dead, Chief G-Man." And I remember the night when the message came through from down south that Alvin Karpus had been located. And I watched Mr. Hoover in the middle of the night call the members of the special squad as they flew down to New Orleans, and he was determined to take this man himself. And he did. It was kind of comical in a way, as he afterwards laughed about it, because all the other men, they just weren't used to having the boss do the arresting. The boss is supposed to direct, but he's going to do it himself. And so he got in position, they watched him coming out, and he had his bodyguard. Karpus had a bodyguard with him. And a youngster ran in the way, would have been right in the gunfire. That fouled up things, sort of, and everything. And finally, Mr. Hoover stopped. Karpus, he was creepy, believe me. I saw him in Alcatraz when we were inspecting that prison one time, and he was still creepy. He had him working in the kitchen, and he ran down the stairs so he would avoid having to see any of us. But in any event, he was just shaking when Mr. Hoover said, "G-Man," or FBI rather, "you're under arrest." But then nobody had a pair of handcuffs. Mr. Hoover said, "That's about the most mismanaged arrest that was ever made in the history of the Bureau, and I'd have fired anybody else who would have done it so badly." But the word sort of went out that the head G-Man was not afraid, and a lot of congressmen criticized him because he could have been killed. And these were days when people were being machine gunned down right and left. We'd lost a number of our agents. Police were being killed. Some of these gangsters, like Machine Gun Kelly, prided himself in walking into a bank, shooting a clerk or a cashier, and then saying, "Now I'll take the money." It's the first thing he did, walking into a bank on occasion. These are the kind of ruthless things that were happening in those days. And I watched Mr. Hoover on other occasions when he would tell the President of the United States that his Undersecretary of Treasury was an arch agent of the future enemy and perpetrator and planner of World War III. And I watched him react as that president doubled that man's salary and put him in charge of the World Bank and the United Nations. I tell you, that's pretty frustrating. And there are those that have not been close to Mr. Hoover who understandably have been critical of the fact that he didn't do more to expose the very men he worked for. He asked for advice on that occasion. Some of us were foolish enough to give him our advice. It wasn't very penetrating. We felt it was time to go to the people. I've watched others do the same thing. He was shrewd enough to perceive that if he did it, it would be the only and the last time he ever went to the people. And all of the equipment, the reservoir of information, the vast cadre of well-trained, fine American youth that he had made into agents would be thrown once again back into the miasma of political intrigue and corruption, the burning of the files and the records and so forth. You see, in Mr. Hoover, we had a whole lifetime, a whole generation of experience in administering the affairs of a governmental bureau in Washington under all the stress and pressure of men who hated him and everything he stood for. It was so when he went in as director. One of the top officials, Gaston B. Means, was a secret agent of 2 foreign governments while he was an official of the FBI. And when Mr. Hoover went in, he not only got him fired, but was subsequently responsible for sending him to prison when this man tried to exploit a wealthy woman in Washington by extorting $100,000 from her, pretending that he could return the kidnapped Lindbergh baby. Just a fraud. Well, that was the Mr. Hoover I came to know. He never pretended to be perfect, but he was strong. He never pretended that he didn't make mistakes, and he was very embarrassed when some of them backfired. But he never avoided responsibility. I was proud of him for that. Every letter that came out of FBI headquarters had one name on it. The buck stopped here on the desk of J. Edgar Hoover. And all his letters were either signed personally by him or his immediate secretary, and over his personal responsibility. Now, I have just noted down here a few little things I wanted to mention, and then I'll close. I remember the first day in agent school, he said, "I want you men to understand that we're very strict in the Bureau. Don't expect not to be penalized. If you make a mistake, you will be penalized. You will also be rewarded when you do a good job. But," he said, "I want to tell you something I do not forgive. I can forgive a mistake of the mind if it doesn't occur too often. I never forgive a mistake of the heart. And if you ever betray this Bureau or what it stands for, you might as well resign, because otherwise you will be fired. I want you to understand that." And we all did. We patted our credentials and our badge and said, "Fidelity, bravery, integrity." And he sort of bred it into us. We had that feeling. Now, I was asked to write a little article for a national magazine. Here are a few of the quotes. "Mr. Hoover did more than any man since the founding of the country to give professional law enforcement the dignity, integrity, and sense of service which it needed. And I used to be in police training. I did it for 6 years. And it was thrilling to see police departments get up out of the basement and the gutter where they had been consigned for several generations and stand up, get new uniforms, be reorganized, get rid of the corrupt politicians that were intimidating them, and begin to be the men they always wanted to be and only needed a chance. And it was the image of J. Edgar Hoover that made that possible. He introduced scientific crime detection methods and uniform investigative procedures to combat the underworld. I was in the FBI early enough to see him go to the big police departments and ask them to train our FBI agents. They didn't even know how to train their own people. And I saw the training division of the FBI start out from scratch, go out in an open territory and ask themselves, now what it would be like, you got 5 men in a car, you come up with 2 FBI agents, you pull them over, what do you do next? It wasn't in any book. How do you pull them out of a car? How do you have them do the spread eagle? That's all FBI. That was all developed experimentally. And we had some men killed. And out of those lessons, we learned how to do it better. We had one of our agents, after Pretty Boy Floyd, going through wheat field or barley, whatever it was, a grain field. All of us trained to shoot lying down flat on the ground. That's just great in a wheat field, isn't it? He had to put his head up, and every time he did, Pretty Boy Floyd had, 14 notches on his watch fob, each one representing a human life. He was a good shot. And this agent was in charge. He told everybody to stay back. He says, I'll go in and get him out. Wheat wasn't dry enough to burn. And so he went in. But every time he'd raise his head, there'd be a shot, and they were all just barely near misses. So finally this agent took off his hat, sat up, put his elbows on his knees, and got that aim that was necessary, that was steady and easy. And the next time Pretty Boy Floyd got up to run to the next ditch, irrigation ditch, the bullet brought him down. Ever after that, we were all trained to shoot in one position so that if we had to be sitting down and up above the ground, We could do it just like this agent did it. So we learned these lessons. They were hard lessons. The agents now, they shoot a practical pistol course, we call it. It's been afterwards refined, and we have Hogan's Alley and so forth, that things come up out of windows and it turns out to be a deputy sheriff. You're not supposed to shoot that one, you see. And another one comes out and he's holding a girl in front of him as a hostage. Now what do? He's pointing a gun at you. You got your gun out. What do you do? And they grade you on what you do. You decide what to do. Somebody asked Mr. Hoover what he would do. He said, I don't know. You don't ever know until you're in that situation. And we put our agents in as many critical situations as we can think of. And then we afterwards have them think through whether or not it was the wisest possible position. All of that grew out of this training program, which gradually evolved and was shared with the police. Now, the police came up with some originals, too. They're shooting a lot more than FBI agents. It's rougher. It's tougher. You saw Bullet. A little exaggerated, but anyway. We took advantage of everything that was possible in putting the training program. So he developed the first training academy to service the police of the entire country. That's the FBI Police Academy. He set up the first major scientific crime detection laboratory. And it was glamorized a little bit. At the beginning, it wasn't able to do all the things people said it could do. Newspapers and movies exaggerated. Mr. Hoover said, we must be as good as they think we are. We've just got to keep working until we're as good as we think we are. And I'll tell you, I was mighty surprised one day when a cigarette butt came in and they got the blood type out of the saliva. How do you like that? Well, they were constantly developing new and wonderful refinements. When you get a blood type out of saliva and a cigarette butt, that's pretty good. And he created a center for the gathering of national crime statistics. He formulated a coast-to-coast clearinghouse for information on criminal records of the past and the identities of criminals presently wanted. He wrote the first comprehensive government report on the nature and danger of international communism, clear back in the early 20s. He was in the forefront in the fight against Nazi subversion. And the jurisdiction said subversion, not Nazism. And when the politicians intended he should concentrate exclusively on Nazism, he made very certain that it included plenty of investigation of subversion by communists and others. He led the fight against organized crime during the gangster era and forced the underworld syndicates to stay out of the federal domain. One of our presidents tried to compel him by every pressure he could bring on him to take over drug jurisdiction. There is only one basis for federal jurisdiction over drugs, and that's the power to tax. Belongs to the Treasury Department. Not by any stretch of the imagination can it be legally put under the FBI unless you set up a national police force, which Mr. Hoover hated. The whole concept he hated. Gestapo, Ogpoo, these are the things that were represented in it. And so he was much wiser than those who were over him. He vehemently opposed the setting up of any type of national police power. He scolded Congress when they tried to make him the head of a nationalized force to take over the problem of organized crime in the major cities. Maybe he could have done more about it. I was in charge of organized crime reports out of the Los Angeles office. We did everything we could to get jurisdiction. Their smart lawyers kept the big gangsters out of every avenue where we could get our hands on them. We were just 30 days behind Bugsy Siegel when he was murdered. 30 more days, and we thought maybe we could have gotten enough federal jurisdiction to have pulled him out before they liquidated him. He had, over 30 murders to his credit, gangster murders back east. And we did everything we could to get into that organized cadre of crime that he represented. After that, we went over after Bugsy Siegel. Never could get him on a federal violation until income tax finally nailed him. They got him on that technicality. And I'll share with you a kind of an exciting experience. In California, they build apartment houses, you know, even apartment houses without basements. And there's a little area right underneath them where they just have slats, in those days anyway. His apartment, Mickey Cohen's apartment, who is very close to Bugsy Siegel. After Bugsy Siegel's death, Mickey Cohen looked like he was becoming the new head man, and the Cosa Nostra, or Mafia, whatever you want to call it, the Big Brotherhood, were trying to kill off any of the non-Sicilian members. And they were being knocked off. Meatball Gammon went, and Louis went, and some others went, and Mickey Cohen was going, and so the Seeker brothers, they were involved somewhere. Anyway, we were trying to get a little information, so we were putting on a listening device. And the listening devices in the FBI are very carefully supervised. A civilian officer other than the FBI has to know about and clear each one of them. We're putting one on Mickey Cohen. There looks like there's been a threat interstate, and anyway, it's considered to be justified and under the law, and so here we are underneath. And we're using rubber hammers, and we're very carefully laying the line for a legalized listening device. And it's just against the floorboards underneath. Then it's run up on a telephone pole and back to a listening center. We hear them all talking up there. Mickey Cohen and his gang is there. These are killers. And some of them are being killed. Meatball Gammon had been killed just a short time before. Anyway, we're doing this very carefully and very quietly, pounding in these tacks. All of a sudden, one of the women says, "Shh! Listen!" Oh, our heart sank. The next thing we heard was, "Da-da-da-da! The FBI in peace and water." She wanted everybody to listen to her favorite radio program. So we finished the pounding and got out. But in any event, everything that could be done to try and penetrate organized crime without setting up a nationalized police force was done. But their lawyers are smart. They kept them out of federal jurisdiction as they do to this day. And Mr. Hoover methodically avoided becoming involved in drugs as such or organized crimes as such when it involved local jurisdiction only. He was a great American and was trying to avoid the national police system that Brother Dan here has carefully warned us about tonight, because it still could be converted, perverted, and made into the very thing Mr. Hoover is trying to avoid. Now, he vehemently opposed the setting up of this type of thing. He was a passionate defender of civil rights. He threatened FBI agents with instant termination if they ever indulged in coercive or third-degree tactics to elicit confessions. He liked people, especially children. Probably the only serious mistake in his carefully programmed life was his failure to take the time to get married and have a family of his own. I'd only been in the FBI a few months when it was time for me to go home and get married. And I didn't have enough leave. So I wrote a little note to Mr. Hoover. Here's just a messenger clerk writing a little letter to Mr. Hoover. "Please, sir, could I have a couple of weeks extra, without pay, of course, to go out and get my 17-year-old bride, and get married, and come back?" And next thing I knew, my immediate supervisor says, "Mr. Hoover wants to see you." Well, and I'll tell you, I was pretty scared as I walked across that red carpet in that great big office of his. And he pulled out a drawer and put his foot on it. I afterwards learned that was the signal. "Sit down, relax, we're going to have a talk." And we did. Only lasted 2 minutes, but seemed like a half an hour. Most people who interviewed Mr. Hoover were never in there more than 2 or 3 minutes. They would often say it was 15 or 20. But he was that fast. He'd reviewed my file. He knew all about me. He named my parents, my background, all the things about me in just about 30 seconds, just like that. And then he said, "Now you're going to get married. I approve of it. I want you to do that. But legally, I cannot give you leave without pay. I'm sorry I can't do that. The way the law is written, I can't do it. But I can give you 2 weeks leave with pay, and we'll call it a wedding present." And he shook my hand and sent me on my way. In many ways, John Edgar Hoover built the FBI in his own image. He set it up at a grueling administrative pace, the same pace which won him the nickname of Speed Hoover at college. He gave it the bulldog tenacity of his own firm-jawed countenance, so that it would solve 10-year-old bank robberies like the $1 million Brinks case in Boston. The old, it's the Hertz garage, rental garage down here now. He gave it the same tough independence from pressure politics that he had demanded for himself in 1924 when Attorney General Harlan F. Stone offered him the dirty job of cleaning up the FBI. He fought criminal spies and saboteurs on a day and night, year-round schedule and made the whole FBI operate accordingly. Although Mr. Hoover was a hero to millions of admiring Americans, he had his own private hero. It was one of the top G-men of the gangster era named Sam Cowley. The FBI director described Sam Cowley as, quote, the bravest man I ever knew. Sam Cowley had more running gun battles, killed or captured more major criminals than any man in the Bureau's history. Cowley intercepted Babyface Nelson as Nelson was coming down from Wisconsin to Chicago. Sam Cowley had already had a running gun battle with Dillinger and killed him. He was the agent in the wheat field that I told you about that got Pretty Boy Floyd. And now Babyface Nelson was one of the last and the most dangerous of the entire Dillinger gang. And the manhunt was all over the country. He was public enemy number one. And Sam Cowley got a tip that he was coming down from Wisconsin, went up the main highway, saw his car, intercepted him, and turned around and began chasing him. There was a machine gun shootout on the highway with the cars running at about 90 miles an hour. The radiator or motor was damaged in the FBI car, and it slowed it perceptibly. And the area was well known to Babyface Nelson. He went up over a hill, a rise. He knew there was a side road just below the hill. He was able to slow down enough to skid his car sideways, but it blew out 2 tires, but put the car in an excellent position so that as the FBI car came up over the hill, and Sam Cowley tried to see what had happened to the car, it had disappeared. He assumed it must be a side road, went into a 130-foot slide, but all it did was to allow him to slow down so that he just practically glided past Babyface Nelson's car as he machine gunned him down, instantly killed Hollis, the agent, in the car with Sam Cowley, and Sam Cowley was badly wounded. To get a .45 slug into your body, which has the shocking power to knock you down even if it just hits you in the arm, and still be able to get out of your car and have sense enough to know that take the safety off your machine gun, and that's what Sam Cowley did as he staggered out. But the impact was so great that he collapsed behind the car on the road. And Babyface Nelson and his bodyguard and girlfriend that were in the car sauntered out. This marked the 3rd G-man that Babyface Nelson had killed. Now, as far as they could reconstruct it afterwards, Sam Cowley came to just about the time that Babyface Nelson came right up alongside of him to kick him over and see if he was really dead. He had his machine gun sort of slung over his arm. Sam Cowley had his machine gun under his face, but the safety was off. He came to, he took in the situation, and he still had enough self-possession and composure to pull that gun up into position and just hang on the trigger. And he hit Babyface Nelson 17 times. The bodyguard shot Sam Cowley several more times, and they then got into the FBI car, dragging Babyface Nelson's body behind them, and fled in the FBI car. Sam Cowley lived just a few hours longer, and just before he died, the word came they had found the body of Babyface Nelson stripped in a culvert with 17 slugs in it. So Sam Cowley died on that assignment, but he still got his man. He was Mr. Hoover's private hero in the Bureau. Now, it was mentioned earlier tonight that Mr. Hoover taught a Sunday school class. Those of us who also taught Sunday school classes had a special little dispensation from him on Sabbath day. Sam Cowley was a Sunday school teacher. After I went to Washington, I taught his same Sunday school class. And Sam Cowley's widow told me that sometimes Sam would be up in New Jersey or Chicago, and if the circumstances would at all permit, Mr. Hoover would allow him to fly back to Washington for Sabbath day services so he could teach his Sunday school class. And it wasn't a little class. It had 300 members in it, filled a whole church. 300. During Mr. Hoover's 48 years of service, his critics were almost exclusively those who had reason to fear him. They were usually men with secret tainted histories, who suspected their venal activities may have been recorded in the FBI files on subversion, corruption, and crime. These men wanted Mr. Hoover out and a politician in, a friendly politician who could clean out the files. Libel and slander were often used to discredit Mr. Hoover, but time always exposed their phony charges. Only a few days before his death, columnist Jack Anderson accused the FBI director of preparing memos for President Johnson, which served as bedtime reading on the sex lives, drinking habits, and personal affairs of prominent public officials. What Mr. Anderson failed to mention was the fact that two of the most serious security problems among high officials in Washington are alcohol and sexual promiscuity. FBI reports on high officials recklessly passing along highly confidential information in bars and bedrooms is a lot more serious reading for worried presidents than mere bedtime stories. At least that's the way Mr. Hoover saw his job. Well, as he went on year after year, unable to resign, unable to turn over custody of what he held now, which was so precious and so important, and maybe the key, the secret to the preservation of the heritage of America, that responsibility weighed mighty heavily upon him. And I'm told, for I was not there, that he vouchsafed to those who were confidentially close to him that he was feeling this terrible disease of blood pressure creeping up on him, which meant eventually a stroke. He said, I haven't the strength to carry the battle like I used to, but at least I can stand between you and the politicians. You do the work. And it was in that spirit that he served out his final days, at least 10 to 15 years longer than he would like to have served it, had those above him been worthy of the trust of selecting a successor. They did not have his point of view. They did not feel the same way about America that he felt. He was a constitutionalist. He was a legalistic constitutionalist, a literal constructionist. And so let me close where I began. He had the tough-mindedness and the will to win of a General Patton. He had a sense of history and the importance of the role he was playing, similar to General MacArthur. He had a great sense of human compassion and common touch for people like Lincoln. And he stood humble in the presence of a monumental task which had been given him and took pride in doing the job well, as did Washington. In a sense, he fulfilled what the poet said when Edward Hale wrote, as nearly as I can remember it, this challenge to each of us. I'm only one, but I am one. I can't do everything, but I can do something. And what I can do, that I ought to do. And what I ought to do, by the grace of God, I shall do. J. Edgar Hoover did it, I think, to the very best of his ability. God bless his memory.